Maybe you've been reading in the newspapers lately and have noticed that the United Methodist Church isn't the only church that is struggling with problems these days. The Roman Catholic Church is finishing up today their 4-day gathering in the Vatican, a conference of bishops, to talk about their own clergy sexual abuse scandal. And just a couple of weeks, and still in the newspapers, just a couple of weeks ago, the Southern Baptist Convention was outed by the Houston Chronicle. 200 plus convicted sex crimes among the clergy and volunteers who are still serving in their positions in churches. That's just in the news just recently. There are many other churches that struggle over one thing or another, and maybe they don't make the news, but they still struggle, and it's an old problem. You remember the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they didn't agree on things in Jesus' day. And the prophets, they often had many different opinions on how things were going to be, and the ones that were in keeping with the Jewish faith were written up in the scriptures, and the others were not. We humans are so easily distracted, so easily sidetracked, so easily persuaded to head in a direction that is not faithful, that does not have priority with what God would have us do. And sometimes we go in those directions without even thinking. It's not conscious for us that we're doing some of this stuff. And it's like we're following a crowd. It's like we're doing peer pressure, like we're just moving ahead on instinct or autopilot. Now you know what crowd behavior is, right? It's where people get so wound up because they're gathered together in a crowd that they go and they do things that they might not otherwise do on their own. We train soldiers deliberately to march against a foe using crowd mentality, and it's the only way that soldiers could actually be successful as soldiers. So sometimes this crowd mentality is a good thing. Sometimes crowd mentality is used to confront injustice. Think of the civil rights marches, think of women marching for the right to vote, think of demonstrations to abolish slavery, think of people who threw the tea into the harbor protesting taxation without representation. Think about the time that the people gathered on the side of the road waving palm branches to celebrate a king riding into the city. But don't forget about the crowds who gathered to cry together, "Crucify him," just a couple days later. Crowd mentality. You notice how many of these situations involved violence, or led to violence, or prompted violence, or even war. You might also remember some of Jesus' words about violence. Remember, he said, when you're struck, to turn the other cheek. Remember how he said to the soldier or to the disciple who cut off the soldier's ear in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Put away your sword." Even the scripture reading that Pat just read for us today, when the disciples are at Caesarea Philippi, which by the way is now an abandoned city, a mostly abandoned city, Jesus going there was a teaching against violence, because they went to the city, they went to this location that had been a location of battles in the old days, a location where Alexander the Great had conquered in the old days, a place where the Romans had also conquered, a location that was named for Caesar, who was a conqueror, a location where nobodies became even less somebodies, especially those nobodies who were Jewish, which Jesus was. And yet, he took his disciples to that location to teach them. And while they were there, he said, "Who do the people say that I am?" And he asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Jesus wondered, would they follow the crowd? Would they go with the crowd mentality? Or would they see Jesus for whom he really was? Would they understand that Jesus was different from all the other conquerors who had muscled their way in with armies and weapons and forced the conquered people to be subjected to another power, ruled by another domination and another fear and more punishment? Or would the disciples understand that Jesus' power was different? For Jesus' power originated in relationship and in mercy and in forgiveness and in grace. Grace, divine love that originates in God's own self. Now, in answer to the first question, the disciples answered, well, the people are saying you're John the Baptist, or you're one of the disciples, one of the great prophets. But in answer to the second question, Peter spoke, and he spoke well. You are the Christ, he said. You are the Son of the living God, which translated means you are not the prophet who will tell us the Messiah is coming. You are the Messiah, which also translates to say, you are the liberating King. Now Jesus is pleased with Peter. But Peter quickly shows that he only halfway understands. Like many, Peter believes that the Messiah is going to come in and liberate with armies and secular things and secular ways. And Peter expects Jesus to be raising up that army and confronting the powers of government with swords. But Jesus knows that violence cannot be defeated with violence, and hate cannot be defeated with hate, and fear cannot be defeated with fear. Domination does not get defeated by domination. Jesus knows that God does things differently with a different sort of power. God achieves victory through what the world sees as defeat. Jesus' death. And God achieves glory through what the world sees as shame, that cross, that capital punishment tool that's a humiliating thing. That's where God finds glory. And God is strong through apparent weakness, for God's power, and thus Jesus' power, comes through forgiving and loving. And God's leadership comes through serving God's people, beginning with Jesus and then flowing on to others, serving with healing brokenness and feeding hungers and giving drink to the thirsty, and then in the most humblest of tasks like washing feet. God's gift of life comes through death. Dying like a seed dies and goes into the earth so that it can germinate and grow. Dying to the old ways of being so that we can live anew. God's ways are not the ways of people. Instead of sending another warrior, King David, God sent Jesus, the Prince of Peace, who has more power than any other person, living, dead, or resurrected, and who gives us that same power. Jesus, with the most power ever, gives it to you and me. Here we are 2,000 years later. We know about the death and resurrection of the Christ, and we claim that it's part of our faith, and we like to think that we're better than Peter, who didn't quite get it yet. But I think we kid ourselves. We might not walk around with swords on our hips, but what about the handguns in our purses and our glove boxes or other places that are easily accessible to children or angry youth or desperate adults? And what about the other weapons we use, our sharp tongues and our lacerating words and our pummeling arguments? What about weapons of economic pressures and barricades? What about weapons of broken promises, forgotten commitments, and violated trust? Violated trust seems to be particularly deadly. When adults are supposed to keep children safe, instead molest them and violate their bodies and their emotions. When partners are supposed to be teammates, become source of pain instead. When bosses and supervisors who are supposed to encourage and enable and mentor, instead blackmail and threat. Perhaps you or I don't personally do or experience these things, but we might know somebody who has. And when we do we believe the victims? Do we protect the perpetrators? when we don't believe the victims, when we tell the victims to stop making life difficult for perpetrators, when we claim that religious leaders could not be at fault or at least could not be held accountable because they're a religious leader, then Jesus says to us, "Get behind me, Satan." Jesus' own ministry and words have declared that Jesus came to liberate those who are oppressed by the abusers of power. Jesus told us, "Let the vulnerable come to me, for to such as them belong the kingdom of heaven." You know, instinct makes us want to fight when we experience a threat. Instinct leads us to want to hurt back rather than to defend ourselves or to walk away. When I used to talk with little kids about stranger danger and how when they were faced with a dangerous person that they should run and get an adult they trust, and more often than not these little 3 feet tall people would stand up and say, "I'll just punch him in the nose." You know that's not going to go very far, right? From adults I hear more grown-up words like, "I'll sue the pants off them." Mary Hike is a clergy person in our conference, and she is at that meeting in St. Louis. She's the clergy delegate from our conference. She wrote the blog post that goes with the chapter that is for this week's worship in the book that we've been reading together. And I'd like to read you some of the things that she said. She's referring to Ephesians chapter 6. And she writes, "I've always been bothered a bit by that section of Ephesians that talks about putting on the whole armor of God. Such a warlike image, it didn't fit for me. But as I read through it recently, I understood it in a way that turned my earlier reading on its head. I see it now as saying that the way to withstand evil in this world is neither through defensiveness nor aggression, but through the power of authenticity and vulnerability. Take up," it says, "the breastplate of righteousness. Righteousness is best interpreted as being in right relationship with God, with others, and with self. The protection the heart needs comes not from shielding it, but through opening it and being in relationship as Jesus practiced it, authentic, caring, differentiated. The sword of truth. While caring deeply for others, Jesus spoke honestly. He didn't soften his words to please others, nor did he sharpen them to wound. His yes was yes, his no, no. He was open with his opinions, but was also open to learning from others. And then finally, shoes that make you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. There's an inner attitude that allows you to see not just the difficulty of a situation in front of you, but to stand firm in God's hopes and possibilities for it. Jesus embodies this in the healing stories and in facing his own arrest and death. Living, dying, and in resurrection, he proclaimed peace. I have come that you might have life, he said, and have it abundantly. This vulnerability in the face of conflict and difficulty is a crossing over that I aspire to, Mary writes. Of course, it gets dismissed as naivete. I've had people tell me, you'll grow out of it once you learn how the world really works. I pray I don't, she finishes. Like Mary, I pray that we don't grow out of that naivete, but that we grow into the whole armor of God with authenticity and vulnerability. For only then will we have the power of Jesus to tap into. Amen.
Amen.